This week we're looking together at monuments and memorials. And this is really a couple of topics to consider together. My approach or interest is that I want us to think together about the ways that monuments and memorials merge the civic and the religious, especially through what we might call civic religion, and the ways that monuments and memorials contribute to the creation of civic and or political sacred spaces. And we'll conclude by looking at the transformation and sometimes destruction of those spaces or aspects of the spaces. So more specifically, of course, you know where I'm going with this, in light of the protests and the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, a question that we are going to entertain together is, what do we do with these negative or empty spaces that are left behind after the removal and or destruction of monuments? And something we'll talk about in class together and do some kind of problem solving, thinking together, conversation about how do we approach what is arguably an opportunity to educate, to transform, to challenge, and so on in the kind of vacuum that's left behind. So some questions that circulate here is, or topics, maybe it'd be better to say, the role of public memory. I've already mentioned education. We'll be just looking at a couple of examples here, but in these examples and in things we're going to be talking about in class, to think about scale, both physical scale, of course, but maybe also the scale of, when we think about memory and time, the scale of the or relationship between the personal and the public, the crowd, right? Where's access, both in terms of the ideas, but also physical access. So we'll maybe add to this kind of list of some questions, but who is the audience for memorials, and where do they emerge, and what's the context of them, so on and so forth. We're going to move at a rip-roaring speed here, but I just want to make a couple of kind of a nod to the long history of memorials and monuments and their different functions. I'm going to do it very briefly through two images before getting us into the 20th century and the modern era, and we're really just going to be looking at a few examples. So I'm happy to return to any of these topics in our time together. We're going to be focusing especially on the theme of the destruction of monuments and this kind of negation. But first, let's start with Hatshepsut. So in the ancient world, as you might expect, monuments were often erected to rulers and to successful battles. Also included, bust portraiture and full-length and larger-than-life statues, as in this case, which is a larger-than-life kneeling statue. It's almost 10 feet tall. And this is a statue of the pharaoh Hatshepsut, who is one of the several female pharaohs in ancient Egypt. And as is often the case, she was depicted with male ruling attributes. She presented herself as a pharaoh. So one example is the kilt and the false beard. It's shown in her chin here. They're often damaged. The white crown of Upper Egypt, and she's shown. So this is the statue would have been at her temple at Deir el-Bahari. Um, and this was one of several, at least 10 of these oversized statues. So she's shown having these pots in her hands, and she's in the act of making an offering to the god Amun. Um, and we also know these statues are her because of the inscriptions and the cartouches on the base there. So this is one way that we see monumental depictions of rulers in the ancient world as a kind of model in a religious, I mean, this is a civic religious kind of space, you could say, too, because the role of the emperor and the pantheon of deities were intertwined in the sense that for a lot of Egyptian culture, the pharaoh could be divinized after death, right? And as you would expect, too, there are also monuments to battles to commemorate battles that are erected in the ancient world. And there's so many of these, I'm just going to show you one famous example. But on the right-hand side, we're seeing the Column of Trajan, which dates to the early 2nd century, still standing in Rome, the Forum there. And as the name implies, it was dedicated to the Emperor Trajan to honor his victory over Dacia, or Dacia, which is now Romania, modern day Romania, about a decade before the construction of the statue. So there's the few components to the statue, the base, and then there's a single spiraling frieze that, or register that winds around the column itself. And it shows scenes of the Roman soldiers marching off to war. It shows their victory, the Romans' victory. And it, of course, part of this is not just showing the Romans or the army's victory, but the kind of achievements of the Emperor Trajan as this kind of ideal emperor. So it also, it narrates the context of these battles, shows the defeat, and elevates Trajan, and is kind of, monuments being erected like this in a public sphere is really a kind of PR move, right? It's presenting the emperor in a certain light and asserting his authority, both in like a physical, monumental way, and then also in this like telling the story, so to speak, of usually a particular battle or a campaign or something like that. There's also, oh gosh, Arch of Constantine. I mean, many different monuments like this throughout the ancient world, not just in Rome. But so there you have it. So two ancient examples. This is me signaling to you public monuments like these go way back. And in both cases, the civic and the religious are blended. But I hope you don't get whiplash from how far in the future we're going to jump. So we're hopping all the way to the 20th century, to a monument that you are likely familiar with if you haven't visited it personally, and that is the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's located on the National Mall. And I share this one because, well, it's a war memorial that's not quite about triumph. So it's a contrast from the Column of Trajan. But it also is a good example of the ways in which memorials are contested and can be controversial exactly because they are powerful spaces, powerful places. They often become pilgrimage sites of a sort. They're, people, depending on how innovative the design is. People may love them or hate them. There's a, and they have personal significance for people who um, maybe lost someone in the event related to the memorial and so on, right? It's no different with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And it was made perhaps more complicated or more contested by the fact that the commissioning of the memorial coincided with the culture wars of the 1980s, right? So Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and we have this kind of battling battling over or negotiating the federal agenda in the first early years of his presidency, in which you have kind of social conservatism and neoliberals. Basically, what we have is the beginning of the culture wars in the way that we have them or experience them still today. And the Maya Lin's design for the War Memorial was caught up in some of that rhetoric, right? So actually, even though it's cared for, it's on the National Mall, it's cared for by the Parks Department, it was actually an initiative by a private citizen, by an independent person, which is to say that the private sector, Jan Scruggs, who's a Vietnam veteran and wounded in duty. I wonder if you pronounce his name Jan. Anyway, the point being that he was a Vietnam veteran. He had been wounded in duty, and he decided to raise the money and seek the support to commission a Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which he successfully did do, and the bill was passed in the summer of 1980. So what the call, and as is often the case, there was an open call for proposals to anybody, not just architectural firms. So they were, and Scruggs himself didn't want to weigh in on, or didn't want the memorial to, I suppose, be political, right? To say, to kind of glorify the war or to criticize it, wanted it to focus on the veterans. So there was the open competition. They're looking for things that are, the call for the competition asked for designs that were harmonious, that were conciliatory, so not divisive, right? Contemplative, things like this. So, and you know how the story ends, Maya Lin's design was chosen unanimously by the committee. She was a 21-year-old undergraduate student at Yale at the time. And although, even though her design was unanimously approved and affirmed, it was pretty much instantly a problem or instantly criticized by everybody, veterans and politicians and architecture critics and things like that, right? So it was read by these various groups as being anti-war, as being, as not, because it didn't glorify the war, it was read as being anti-war. And there were all kinds of, you can just Google the incredible amounts of criticisms of the monument and the kinds of things was referred to as the degrading ditch, or the black gash of shame, for example. So it's made from this striking black granite. It is kind of I mean, you could see they maybe read that as a wound into the side of the hill because it's a low slope. So you walk down into it. And it really, pushed back on. It did not. What do I want to say here? It did not do all of the things that monuments did previously, right? Um, it used polished black granite instead of like limestone or like marble or granite. Um, it had a long, it has this long, low horizontal positioning instead of emphasizing the vertical or having portraits and things like that. Um, the people also criticized that it, consists of this list of names, some of which you can see here, right? Um, that they said that it, people who criticized the listing of the names said that it, made them into individuals instead of like a collective group, and so it was like a laundry list of tragedy instead of um, taking a perspective on the war. Um, and going back to the previous image, so it decenters so many aspects that had previously been like just dominant and accepted aspects of monuments, right? um, you're not moving around something. It's in a park. It has this kind of, well, very natural component. um, there's not a right or wrong way to enter it. um, there's this reflective, I mean, there's like a gazillion of these very compelling images of people, you know because it's highly polished granite. They can It works as a mirror as well. There's a place for leaving materials. People often come and do, you know, crayon rubbings of names and things like that. And if you're interested, if you haven't already, there's a documentary about that. But um, despite all of this controversy, um, Maya Lin's design did become, really influential in the visual language of um, what a monument was, right? And we see that in many monuments in America. More recent example being the memorial for the 9/11 memorial at the Ground Zero for the World Trade Center. So, um, and we're moving in here into thinking about absence, which is going to be a theme for this week's class, and visualizing absence or embodying absence is something that I want to think about together. So, as you know, the 9/11 Memorial honors the 2,977 people who were killed in the attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11th in 2001. And then also near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon. And it also actually commemorates the 6 people who died in the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And here are the towers. Actually, this photo was taken on the day of. And another kind of theme here is, of course, for our architecture class, we're thinking about more permanent monuments and memorials. But a really essential and very real aspect of memorializing are those more ephemeral monuments that emerge after a tragedy. And these are often very personal objects, sometimes, drawings and printed off elements, homemade kind of things, in other words, or photos, flowers, bits of clothing, stuffed animals, whatever, the case may be. There's things that after they've been left outside for a long time will deteriorate. And such was also the case at Ground Zero of the World Trade Center. During the cleanup period of the site, there were fences all around. And so then, there were a big component is images of missing people were attached to the fence, but then also memorial kind of objects and papers and things like that. This particular photo is at St. Paul's Chapel, which was very close, is very nearby the World Trade Center, and was not destroyed, and so became a kind of immediate site for memorial and for getting resources to people in the community. Another kind of ephemeral, although more monumental in scale, commemoration of the tragedy is what's known as the Tribute in Light. So this is an art installation. It's, as you can see in the image, it's two beams of light, and actually these two beams of light are made from 88 searchlights that are oriented vertically to create these two columns of light that represent the Twin Towers, right? So it has a kind of ghostly effect, a kind of illuminated, because they're so powerful, transcendent, I guess, quite literally as well. So this installation began as a temporary installation in 2002, but then became an annual event. And I believe that they're still, despite the pandemic, planning to do it this year, which will be the 20th anniversary. But of course, from very early on, from very early on, they're thinking of other ways to more permanently memorialize the event. So in 2003, actually, an international design competition was launched for a permanent memorial for the World Trade Center. It was opened to any adult from any country, of any nationality, of any discipline, and the call, or the call asked for designs that would, of course, honor the victims, and honor the victims in a way that connected to the families of those victims and created a healing and meditative or reflective space in the city. So in 2004, the design by Michael Arad, who's a architect, and Peter Walker, who's a landscape architect, won the design. And their submission is called Reflecting Absence. And as you can see here, and we'll get a detail in a minute, features two pools that are the footprints of the two buildings. There are also, so it's these two pools set within the plaza, and then it's also covered in oak trees, which we'll come back to in a minute. The memorial opened on September 11th in 2011, so that's 10 years after the 9/11 attacks. So as you can see in this image, on the street level, we're standing by one of the memorial pools. And it's not just a pool, but also has water cascading down. Each pool is about an acre in size. And actually they contain the largest man-made waterfalls in North America. So they're 30 feet above human-made, 30 feet into a square basin. And then, okay, so you can see here, I'll give you a vertical in a second, but a vertical and an aerial shot, 20 feet, no, 30 feet down here. And then there's another 20-foot descent in the center there, which is very difficult to see when you're standing there. So that, in other words, that means that the sound of the water flowing is part of the water feature, or is part of the environment or the ambiance. Obviously, there's street noise because it's New York City, but then the kind of tranquil sound of the water. You can also see in this image the names of some of the people. These are inscribed in bronze that go around the edge of the pools, and they're organized actually by the locations and the circumstances of the respective victims. So they're kind of grouped accordingly. And that, I suppose, facilitates, and actually I have an image here, finding names of victims. And there's, of course, lots of information at the site and staff that can help you find them. I mentioned the trees just a minute ago. There are over 400 trees that are that were planted at this site. They are swamp white oak trees, and they were selected because they are a hardy kind of tree, and also these trees are native to the 3 crash sites of 9/11. There's also one Callery pear tree on the site. This tree was discovered during recovery efforts at Ground Zero, and so they actually retrieved the tree and nursed it back to health, and so the tree is still at the site and is known as the survivor tree, which is incredibly impressive. And especially when you think about how there's lots of evidence that, well, I shouldn't say lots of evidence because I'm not a tree scholar, but there's evidence that trees have memory, and trees have memory through, well, roots and also mushroom type entities and things like that. Okay, I can get you an article on it. I'm not making stuff up. It's true. All right. There's also more. Oh, no, I don't think I have a photo of this. Sorry. There's also a memorial glade. It might be in this part right here. Sorry about that. But the memorial glade was added just 2 years ago in 2019, and that's actually to memorialize the people who have gotten sick and or died from exposure during the aftermath of 9/11. Okay, and here you go. You can see a bit more into that central pool. So we'll keep here in our mind thinking about questions of, well, scale, how the visitor moves through the space. This one's really guided by commemorating the dead, of course, and specific, like by name, but also a place where people who still live in the city and who are maybe related to those people can come and have a serene place, right? Can walk around, can be under the shade of trees, to hear the running water. But you also can't get away from the fact that this design is 2 large holes in the ground in the footprint of these buildings. So it's just such a huge physical and spiritual and emotional emptiness, vacuum, loss. Okay, well, we're moving from commemorating absence, and we're actually kind of going to move back in time here, but we're thinking about absence and loss. I couldn't help but think about several Holocaust memorials that employ an empty chair. So we're just going to look at 3 examples, and there are also many, many uh, Holocaust memorials in Europe that we consider, but we'll just look at these 3 very briefly. So one of these, this is in Leipzig in Germany, and it is composed of 140 chairs neatly lined up here. And this installation symbolizes the destruction of a synagogue on this very spot on November 9th in 1938. So it gives the sense of an assembly, right? So both a sense of assembly and absence held together or kind of suspended in these neatly lined up chairs. And those neatly lined up chairs may also invoke the rounding up of the Jews by the Nazis, right? The lines and the accounting. In Berlin, there's a maybe more subtle installation. This is in a park in Berlin, and it was installed in 1996. It's a metal sculpture of 2 chairs. One is upright still at a table, and the other is knocked back. And the title is The Deserted Room. There's also an inscription of a poem by Nelly Sachs, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1966, was a German Jewish poet who had fled Nazi Germany with her mother. So the text of her poem, which I have in English there on the right-hand side, goes around the edge of this little square. But one of these chairs is permanently knocked over, is installed this way. And what it does is, it is what the deserted room is, right, is the scene in which someone has just been taken away. So there's a sense of, even though there's no figures portrayed, there's a sense of something's been interrupted and someone's left the table quickly, right? So they've been called away, as so many were. This has received some criticism, and as some of these memorials in Germany have, for being too open-ended or ambiguous, and that one might not know what it's meant to depict, right? So that's a question too about memorials and the role of education. There's this inscription. Some memorials don't have much in the way of, educational materials unless it's at a museum or something like that, right? So. Okay. One more with empty chairs. This is what's known as Ghetto Heroes Square in Krakow in Poland. This installation, which is a series of, I think, 33 chairs, I want to say, but it's an installation of a group of chairs that are kind of scattered about on the square. The square, you know, like any city square in Europe, had been a place for markets and for meeting and for trading and for so on, you know, in the early 20th century. When Poland was occupied by the Nazis, this particular square became part of the Jewish ghetto there. So it would still be a place for meeting and for those things that I just mentioned. But as time went on in World War II, it was also a site where the final Hitler's final solution, quote unquote, was implemented in Krakow. So, meaning it was the place where people were put on trains and sent to places like Auschwitz. So there were these life and death decisions made, whether people were being sent on these trains or often just killed in the square itself. You know, so there were executions here in the square, there were executions in people's homes, in other kind of side streets and so on in this area. This the square is also featured in Schindler's List, the Steven Spielberg movie. So most of the people here would end up meeting there, that most of the Jewish people here would end up dying in Auschwitz or in the camps like Belzec. And so because of that deportation or being sent to the camps, the city square would be largely empty. So there is this, and that emptiness or that absence remained, of course, once the war ended, or even after the war ended. The population, the Jewish population in Krakow was before World War One was World War One, before World War II was something like 60,000 people, and after the Nazi occupation, there were only something like 5,000 Jewish people left. So this installation, this sculpture installation in 2005, commemorated that absence and really defining, you know, by having these chairs rather than in a line. So thinking of like assembly in the previous image, installing them in this scattered about way marks out but kind of takes up more of that space of the square and really I don't know, I think articulates the way that emptiness defined the city space, right? And does, and there's still that echo of it today. I mentioned at the outset that where I want to get us to, and I don't mean to rush through these things or plod through them, but I suppose I have an itinerary. And when I was thinking of this class session or this week, of course, I was thinking of, excuse me, one more image. Actually, so the chairs are poignant too because of this absence, like I said, in the earlier sculpture that we saw of the turned over chair, but also the ways in which, you know, Jewish people were, as they were told to be leaving, the Jews were being kicked out of their homes or being moved to other spaces or being moved to the ghetto or so on, or being told to come to the square like this and bring their own chairs so that they can sit and wait and so on. So we have photos like these on the left, which make the installation all the more poignant. Okay, so I got a little bit ahead of myself. Now, got that I'm got myself in order. What I was just saying was that as I was designing the class and thinking of this week and monuments and memorials, of course, part of my impetus for that and part of my interest in including a session like this was because of our own context in the Twin Cities, the murder of George Floyd, the memorials that emerged in the aftermath, and the way that destruction of monuments were part of that response. So here's an image from George Floyd Square. So we're going from a square, a memorial square that was empty in the case of Krakow and Poland, kind of emphasizing or trying to visualize absence, right? In this case, we have a kind of abundance, although it's been recently cleared in June. But there was an immediate, as we see often with tragedies, that was a kind of immediate, personal and ephemeral memorial action. So the photos that we see here, candles, notes, flowers, did I just say flowers? Signs, really anything you could think of, stuffed animals, all kinds of things, photos and so on. So there's this ephemera that is replenished. There are gardens that were then being planted. And that's one stage. There are murals as well. Some of them, the one we see in this image, is more permanent, but then you also have, oh, and here's a bigger view of the square. Billboards have been incorporated. This is some of the garden elements I was just referencing. There were also murals around the city and cities around the country too. So some of these were doubling as either protecting, the windows of businesses and so on, or boarding them up after there had been some damage done as part of the in the aftermath or during some of the protests and uprisings. And then you also have the complications of folks coming from outside of the community and doing damage. But which is to say, some of these boards, there's been community groups that are collecting them and preserving them. And so even though it's a kind of like an ephemeral medium, thinking about archiving and ways of commemorating and making that process or that learning, right, more, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Sorry. Making that learning, preserving it, as a learning opportunity for the future and as a resource for the future. Okay. So there are these types of memorials where they are maybe organic, they're community-led, they're public expressions of mourning, they're ephemeral, created from ephemeral objects. So maybe things, ranging from flowers and posters to spray paint and plywood. But there's also a piece of this which is the more permanent structures that are being torn down. And let's hope that white supremacist structures are one of those structures that are being torn down. But I mean, physically, the large stone, often stone or bronze monuments that have been torn down in our country over the last year, just over a year, right? And actually, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, 168 Confederate symbols have been removed in the US in 2020. 94 of those were monuments, these Confederate symbols. there are still more than 2,000 public Confederate symbols that are on display today, and 704 of those are monuments, so not just plaques, I suppose. And an important thing to note, I think my next slide actually has text on it, so that's why I'm waiting here, is that most of these Confederate monuments were built between the 1890s and 1950s. That is during the era of Jim Crow segregation. And then you had even more that were erected during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So that is to say, they weren't built in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. They were built during this time of the civil rights movement. So it's a very clear, I would read that as a very clear counter to the civil rights movement in America, which means that the effort to remove these symbols, which didn't really begin, well, the effort to remove these symbols is directly tied to the civil rights, to civil rights and the status of civil rights in America. But you, I'm sure, remember that there were earlier removals of these symbols, not just in 2017. Not just in 2017, not just in 2020, but earlier in 2017, for example, they were, and in the years following 2017. So, of course, the Unite the Right rally occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. And that convened to protest the plans that had existed to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. And one of the this rally, so-called scare quotes there, resulted in the death of Heather Heyer. So there have been a handful of removals over the years. But in 2017, there was an incredible uptick in that year following that extremist rally. 36 Confederate statues were removed. We've now just about tripled that in 2020, right? So we'll talk more about this in class together. I want to think about the removal of monuments, and we can talk a lot more. We can talk about memorials and other kinds of things. This week I'm definitely bringing my own kind of specific question to this. But on this week, I want to, with our time, we're going to have that kind of practical conversation about the final projects. That'll be the second half of class. The first half of class, I want to put you in groups to think about what do we do with opportunities for learning like this? And in the aftermath of tearing down monuments, what do we do with those spaces? Are there rituals? Are there images we can create? Are there educational programs? What would you do with that kind of opportunity in your community, as indeed we have them? So towards that thinking, towards that class and that conversation that we'll have together this week, I want to leave you with two thoughts by two very different thinkers. One of them is Michael Camille, from very different fields, I'll say. Michael Camille's an art historian. He's my favorite, one of my favorite medieval art historians, and taken my art history class, you might remember me talking about him. But I want to bring in something that he actually says about the intentional destruction or modification of medieval manuscripts and images in medieval manuscripts, but I think applies here. And I want to think about this negation creation by negation kind of a thing. So he says, we must examine such cases of intentional alteration of images, not so much as acts of vandalism, but as acts of representation. We tend to associate creation with construction, not destruction, but the selective obliteration of parts of an image surely constitutes not merely editing and expurgation as with a text, but an embodied response. And he's talking about ways in which an image or part of an image is removed and a vacuum is left, right? A lacuna is left. And that when the redactor doesn't try to cover up their tracks, but they leave that emptiness or they leave evidence that something has been changed, that in and of itself is a new argument, a new assertion, right? That's something that I'd like to think about together when we have these negations in our civic landscape. There's a new argument that's being made, an assertion that's being made through this removal, and then it can be maybe heightened through remnants of the removal, right? And that being visibly like being visible. Oh, don't read this because I want to read another thing, actually. So if you can just close your eyes so you don't get confused by this text because I'm going to read another text. So this quote is one that I also find helpful. This is from a book by, but I'm going to set up the quote with a definition. So that's why I'm asking you not to read it. Christina Sharp is a professor. She's an English professor at, I believe she's still at Tufts University. And this is from her book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, which came out in 2016 with Duke University Press. So the definition I want to give is regarding her title, In the Wake. And she uses this really in a very layered, multivalent way. She invokes the concept of wake. And so I'm going to read an excerpt. This is from page 21 in her book that gives a kind of working definition or multi-layered definition. She writes, wakes are processive. Through them, we think about the dead and about our relations to them. They are rituals through which to enact grief and memory. Wakes allow those among the living to mourn the passing of the dead through ritual. They are the watching of relatives and friends besides the body of the deceased from death to burial and the accompanying drinking, feasting, and other observances, a watching practiced as a religious observance. But wakes are also the track left on the water's surface by a ship, the disturbance caused by a body swimming, or one that is moved in water, the air currents behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow, in the line of sight of an observed object, and something in the line of a recoil of a gun. Finally, wake means being awake and also consciousness. So you can see just from that one quote that she's playing on and riffing on and invoking the many, many connotations in the English language for the word wake. The wake of a ship is one of the primary ones. And she's thinking here about slave ships and the wake, both literal in the ocean and metaphorical and historical, of the wake of the awful legacy of slavery in America. And then the way that that legacy is killing Black people. And so the wake there, right? So anyway, I highly recommend the book, but that's just to let you know what's behind that word wake. There is a lot in her title. But to the quote that is on the slide before us now, I'm going to read this briefly to you. So just as wake work troubles mourning, so too do the wake and wake work trouble the ways most museums and memorials take up trauma and memory. That is, if museums and memorials materialize a kind of reparation, repair, and enact their own pedagogies as they position visitors to have a particular kind of experience or set of experiences about an event that is seen to be past. How does one memorialize chattel slavery and its afterlives which are unfolding still? Might we instead understand the absence of a National Slavery Museum in the United States as a recognition of the ongoingness of the conditions of capture? Sorry, there's a typo there. Because how does one memorialize the everyday? How does one, in the words so often used by such institutions, come to terms with, which usually means move past, ongoing and quotidian atrocity? So I share this quote because I think it's relevant, of course, and not just because it's explicitly mentioning museums and memorials, um, but also because it points to that question of what do we memorialize and how do we do it? And what is capable of being memorialized in this way? Um, and there's a certain, as I try to show in some of these examples, there are common visual languages for memorials and for monuments. What do we do with that? What do we think about that? I'm really excited to talk with you all about these themes. So I'll stop here and we'll look forward to our conversation this week.